the Southern Ohio Farm Show. This is Gigi Neal of OSU Extension in Claremont County, agricultural and natural resources educator.
I'm James Morris, the Agricultural and Natural Resources and Community Development Educator for the Ohio State University Extension in Brown County.
And I'm Brooke Beam, the Ohio State University Extension Educator for Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Community Development in Highland County. And we will be your hosts for the Southern Ohio Farm Show. Good morning and welcome to the Southern Ohio Farm Show, and today's date is June 17th. James, we're going to start with you this morning. Tell us some more about dicamba.
Today we are going to cover some information about the recent news related to the dicamba labels. And at this time, it's still a very fluid situation. There's still a lot that can happen. But at this time, we do have some information related specifically to Ohio that can be beneficial to you moving forward for the rest of the year. We know there's still a lot of questions out there. And again, we can't answer all those questions, but we can tell you what we know at this point and what we know how to move forward for the remainder of the season up to this point. So what we know is as of June 3rd, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals vacated the labels for 3 chemical products that have the active ingredient dicamba. And those 3 products are Astenamax with vapor grip technology, Ingenia, and Fexapan. Now the big question was, and what we noticed, is that Tavium was not included in this, and that's because Tavium was not approved for use when this case was initially filed. So therefore, Tavium is still going to be an option that we can use later on and for the rest of the season, and we'll talk about that option here in just a minute. But EPA released a statement on June 8th that provided some guidance about the use of existing stocks of dicamba for the remainder of the season. Now, that term, existing stocks, is going to be important to remember as we move forward here. But the EPA order addresses the sale, distribution, and use of dicamba for the remainder of this growing season for 2020. And 2 key points out of this, I quote from the EPA statement, is a distribution or sale by any person is generally prohibited except for disposal or return to the registrant. Also, growers and commercial applicators may use existing stocks that were in their possession as of June 3rd. So that's where we talked about that existing stocks. As long as you had it in your possession by June 3rd or on June 3rd, then you're able to be able to use that as existing stock. Now, the reason they use it June 3rd is we look back at the case date when that case was initially approved or the labels were vacated. So this the existing stock must also be used according to the previously approved label and may not be applied after July 31st. So that's according to the EPA statement. And here's where we get into some confusion, I believe. There's a lot of dates floating around, a lot of different information. Now, they said they cannot be used according to the label after July 31st, but the Ohio Department of Ag, ODA, released a statement that said any use must happen before July 1st. So the last day to apply dicamba for Ohio is June 30th. So that other information does not apply to us. The last day to apply dicamba here for Ohio is June 30th. And we also mentioned that we have to abide by the previously approved label in all other categories, and that includes the post-emergence applications must be applied prior to the R1 growth stage, which is the beginning flower stage for our soybeans. As soon as they begin to flower, that's the R1 growth stage. Or no later than 45 days after we plant. So whichever one of those scenarios comes first, the R1 growth stage or 45 days post-plant. So one example of this would be if you planted your beans before May 15th, you would fall under that 45-day restriction. So you would have 45 days after May 15th to plant, which would put you at the June 30th date. Now, if you're after May 15th, you still must follow the R1 growth stage or the June 30th deadline. Now, we also have some more information going forward here. We talked about the Tavium is still an option. Mark Laux mentioned in one of his articles, he gave some great information. You can find it on the Ohio AgNet, or you can find it at agcrops.osu.edu. Again, that's agcrops.osu.edu. And Mark Laux is a weed specialist for Ohio State, and he provides some more information moving forward on how we're going to handle these chemicals and what other options are available. And as Mark mentions, most of our summer annuals have peaked their emergence throughout the month of June. By the time we get to mid to late June, most of our summer annuals have reached their peak of emergence. Now, as we get later into July, that begins to decline. So unless the beans are planted late and they're still small, a post-application will work pretty well in June. And even as we get into the smaller beans, we may have some issues there as we don't have the canopy. But as we mentioned, as we get later into June and into July, that decline of emergence does happen. So that helps us out a little bit, even on some of our lantern planted and some of our smaller soybeans. So as we look at the label restrictions for dicamba, as of today, we only have 13 days left to apply dicamba in Ohio by the time we get to the June 30th deadline. So as you know, if you follow all the other restrictions that we haven't even mentioned yet for the dicamba labels, it's not likely that we will have all 13 of those days if we take into account the adverse weather conditions we may see. So if you're looking to spray dicamba, I highly recommend taking an opportunity of any window you can before that June 30th deadline. So Tavium is another option, and it can be available for application after June 30th, depending on the other label restrictions that it has, which is it must be applied up to the V4 growth stage, which is the fourth trifoliate fully unrolled on the soybean plant, or 45 days after planting. So depending on the crop growth stage and depending on the planting date, you may still have an option to spray Tavium, which again includes dicamba, as a post option. So as we look at non-dicamba post options, really our primary post options will be a glyphosate mix with an ALS inhibitor, which are a couple options of classic and first rate, or you could even mix with a PPO inhibitor, such as FlexStar, Cobra, Phoenix, and Ultra Blazer. And all of these options may not be available, again, keep in mind, due to label restrictions such as crop stage, pre-harvest intervals, and crop rotation for your next season. So important to check out those labels before making any decisions on any other products to use. The other issue here, even though these may be some options, is that our problem weeds such as mare's tail, palmer, water hemp, giant rag, and common ragweed, they may be resistant to some of these chemicals. And in fact, mare's tail is not going to be impacted, or it's not going to have an effect on mare's tail with any of these options. And especially we can talk about water hemp is likely in the same scenario. We know PPO and resistance has been an issue for water hemp and palmer. And for the others, a glyphosate and ALS inhibitor is likely not going to be a very effective option. So depending on what type of weeds we're trying to control here, may be a good option, but it's always good to make sure you correctly identify those weeds, especially mare's tail, palmer, and water hemp as we get into the season. And of course, our last option, if you're looking for replant right now, we're going to be looking at a replant or a double crop, Liberty Link genetics, Liberty Link GT27, and Enlist beans may be an option that you need to switch to if you're looking at being able to, or having to replant, or being able to plant double crops later this season.
Thank you, James. Next, we have Danielle Combs, who is the 4-H Youth Development Educator in Highland County.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Danielle Combs and I'm one of the 4-H educators here in Highland County. Today we're going to be making a 2-liter herb planter. So we have all of our materials here laid out. We have our 2-liter bottle, which has been cleaned, and a lid. We have our twine, our hammer and nail, a marker, scissors, our potting soil, our herbs, and our water. So let's get started. So we've already washed our 2-liter bottle. We are going to take the marker and mark a spot midway around the bottle that we're going to use to cut. It doesn't have to be perfectly in the middle, it's just a nice way to help guide you when making these cuts. And we made our mark, and we're going to take a pair of sharp scissors or an X-Acto knife to cut our 2-liter bottle in half. Sometimes making that first cut can be most difficult. So we have our 2-liter bottle cut into 2 pieces. Now there are some rough edges around both pieces, and I'm going to go back and trim those up just so that we don't cut ourselves on it later. Alright, so we have nice smooth edges now. Now we're going to set those off to the side, and using our hammer and our nail, we are going to poke some holes in our lid. Now if you don't have a nail at home, you can always use a screwdriver as well, but no matter what, make sure you're using adult supervision. Alright, so we created our hole, and now we're going to move on. So next we are going to create a wick for our planter. So using twine, hopefully cotton based, something that's going to absorb the water very well. We are going to want to make sure that the twine fits in the bottom part of the container, and we'll be able to feed up through the upper part of the container. So I'm just going to do a rough measurement to kind of see where we need to cut our twine. I'm kind of feeling like right in here, because we want to allow some extra twine to be able to use to tie our knot. We're going to cut approximately 4 pieces. If your twine is very thin, you could cut more. If your twine is very thick, you could cut a little less. And we're just going to use that first piece to continue to measure off each piece we cut. Alright, so we have 4 pieces of twine cut. This will help create our wick. So about 2 inches up from the bottom, so about right in here, we need to tie a knot. And that knot will rest in our hole, and these pieces will reach down into that reservoir. So now we have our wick. After I tied that knot, our knot kind of wound up a little bit more in the center, but it's alright. So I'm going to take the end that I was planning on putting on the reservoir, and I'm going to kind of twist a little bit. Now when we put it through our bottle cap, this is the part I want in the reservoir. And this is the part I measured, so I'm going to put it in from the back side so that it comes out the top of the lid. Alright, so now we have our wick inside our bottle. We are going to take these pieces and feed them inside the bottle and attach our lid to our bottle. Make sure to hold onto the wick in your hand as you put on the bottle cap, because the knot is on the inside and we don't want it to drop back through. Alright, so now we're going to spread out our wick a little bit, and that will sit down in our water reservoir. We have our pieces that were coming up through the bottle, and we want to spread them out a little bit because these are what are going to help water our plants on a regular basis. Wicks are really great if you're starting from seedlings and trying to grow from seeds. I recommend, if you're using small twine like I am, to use it probably 6 pieces. If you're using a thicker twine, maybe only 4. But today we're going with a plant that's already growing. We're just trying to continue its health. So next we're going to add some potting soil. We're just going to put a little bit in there, that way we can kind of control where our wicks are at and make sure they're spread out. Alright, so we have about a third of it filled with potting soil. Now today I'm using parsley. I also have oregano with us. These are both herbs that I like to cook with, fresh and dried. So we are going to go ahead and try to get this guy out. His soil's pretty dry. I'm going to break some of it up a little bit. We're going to put it down in there. Now, using that soil that I just used or loosened up from the plant, I'm going to put back in to help tighten things up in there. And we're going to continue to make sure that soil is added to help fill the space. If you wanted to do seeds instead of plants, I recommend filling the planter with about 2/3 of the way full of soil, putting your seeds in, and then topping it off. Alright, so I don't have the soil quite to the top, and I'm not packing it down, I'm still giving it lots of air. And that's our planter. But what is the biggest thing we're missing? Food, right? So our biggest plant food is water, right? So my plant was pretty dry to begin with. So we're gonna go ahead and water from the top to help give it a little bit of moisture. We never wanna water to the point like it makes mud. We wanna just dampen the soil. And we may not see any drip down through because like you said, the soil was pretty dry to begin with. So we're gonna lift our planter up. We're gonna add a little bit to our water reservoir and sit our top piece back in there. Probably could add a little bit more water. What's nice with the wick is the wick will draw that water up and back into the planter so that tomorrow we don't have to water our plant. It will water itself. Make sure to keep an eye on your planter with the water levels here, and also maybe check the top of the soil as well with your finger. If it's pretty dry up here, give it a splash of water on the top. Make sure to keep it in a well-lit area, preferably a windowsill if you're keeping it in the house, or somewhere outside where the animals are not going to get to it, but still gets plenty of sunlight. That's our 2-liter herb planter. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. Next, we have Jim Jasinski. Jim, what can you tell us about starting pumpkins?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Jasinski. I'm with Ohio State University, the Department of Extension, the Integrated Pest Management Program. And today we're going to spend a few minutes talking about pumpkins. Now, for those of you who don't grow pumpkins, they are a very important crop in the fall for most growers here in Ohio. In 2019, we planted 3,700 acres of pumpkins, and they had a farm gate value of about $10 million. So it's quite an impact to our economy, especially in the fall. So it's an important crop that we want to talk about. We're talking about jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, the carving pumpkins, not the processing type that you make pumpkin pie out of. We don't really have any of those here in Ohio. And just remember that pumpkins are related to things like squash and watermelon and cucumbers. So those are all kind of in the same family. So the two aspects I want to talk to you about today are roughly fall in two camps. One is basic horticulture and one is basic pest management. As for the basic horticulture, probably the first thing you're going to be doing is selecting your seeds. There are many reputable seed companies throughout the country that you can buy from, and there's literally hundreds of hybrids you can choose from. Small, medium, large pumpkins, different colors, bumps, smooth, whatever suits your fancy, there's a pumpkin for it. One aspect you might want to consider is getting something that's powdery mildew tolerant or resistant, and that's a disease that's going to affect you later on in the fall or maybe sort of midsummer, and you'll be battling this disease till harvest. So if you want to make it easier on yourself, you'll try to find a hybrid that's got powdery mildew tolerance built right into it. So once you select a seed, you're going to see that it has a certain maturity. Could be 85 days, 90 days, 100 days, 20 days. That tells you roughly from planting that seed to how many months or days you can figure on a mature fruit. So if you have a hybrid that's got 90-day maturity, you plant it at the end of May, June, July, August. The end of August is when you should expect to have mature fruit. Now, temperature conditions will affect how fast or how slow the fruit develops. So the 90 days is just sort of a rough guideline. Another thing that you'll discover when you buy seeds is that usually the company will give you a seed chart to tell you what the spacing is going to be. It sort of makes sense that smaller plants are going to require less square footage than larger plants, but how small, how large, that information is in the seed catalog when you buy. So once you've selected the seed, then you have to figure out how you're going to get it into the ground. Are you going to direct seed it by hand? Are you going to jab it in? Have a planter basically put it in the ground for you? And there's all different kinds of planter designs. Are you going to have a vacuum seeder? Are you going to think about transplanting, have a transplanter or do it by hand? All those really are kind of a question of scale and to some extent, how much you invest into the operation. Probably for something, maybe 1 to 2 acres or under, I think you could probably do things by hand. But once you get over 2 acres, I think you're probably going to want to invest in some kind of a machine to make the planting process a little bit easier and more uniform. That's really a decision that each operation makes on its own. Something else is becoming fairly popular is the use of cover crops with pumpkins. And so there's all different combinations. You can think about winter rye that's actually planted in the fall, overwinters, and then grows again in the spring. That's usually killed, pushed down, used as a mat for pumpkins to grow on top of, keeps the fruit nice and clean. There are mixtures of crimson clover. There are mixtures of hairy vetch. We've even done some work recently with mustard cover crop because of some benefits of adding organic matter, possibly slowing some disease pressure. So lots of cover crop options out there. Choose the one that works for you, but just know that cover crops involve another layer of management. So if you decide to wrap those into your program, maybe start slowly and make sure you have the right equipment to be successful. So that's really it for the basic horticulture for this quick program anyway. When it comes to pest management, we really are thinking about controlling insects, weeds, and diseases. A lot of the information that we think about for the various pesticides we use are in the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. So if you need to look something up, that guide is online. You can also buy it at your local extension office. And so when it comes to insects, probably the one that most people focus on early season is the striped cucumber beetle. And that's because it has the potential to do a lot of damage to the seedlings by feeding, but it can also spread bacterial wilt. That disease may not outright kill the plant early on, but later on in the season, it can do that or prevent it from setting fruit. So to try to control this particular beetle, we have a couple of options. We can use seed treatment of something like thiamethoxam, a Farmore F1-400. If you're going to use transplants, you can use different systemic insecticides in the transplant water. You can actually use systemic products that are actually in the furrow if you're going to direct seed. All of those are options that are for systemic products, which means that the product gets into the plant, circulates around, and then basically protects the plant as the insect tries to feed on it. There's also the maybe somewhat preferred method would be to scout the field, and if you see insects in excess of a threshold on those seedlings, then you go ahead and use a foliar application to knock those insects down. That takes a little more time to scout, but that way we really don't have the same level of chance for harming pollinators as if we use the systemic products. So the choice is yours, but those are some of the options. Moving on to weeds, really the basic strategy here is to try to start with a clean field if possible, one you know the history of that shouldn't have too many weeds or have a high amount of weed pressure. You can start with a burn down, and then after you seed, you can use a pre-emergent herbicide. If you have escapes of some weeds, particularly the grasses, you can use a post-emergent product to knock down the grasses, and that won't hurt the growing pumpkins. When we move on and talk about diseases, then we have kind of another area where there's a lot of diseases that like to attack pumpkin plants and fruit. So you've got sort of two classes, those that attack the foliage and those that attack the fruit. Those that attack the foliage primarily are going to be powdery mildew. We get that every year. And sometime around mid-July to first part of August is when this disease will come in. It doesn't overwinter here in Ohio. Once we see it, usually a series of sprays, either protective or systemic, from maybe 7 to 10 days would be appropriate through harvest. So you might end up spraying 5 or 6 times if you start in the end of July and then harvest around the first part or middle part of September. With those soil-borne diseases like fusarium or plectosporium and phytophthora, really the pesticide or fungicide options are pretty limited. There are some products. Usually we just talk about rotating away from those fields for a while and let the spore counts go down. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of resistance and hybrids for those diseases. So if you have some of those and you know you have those on your farm, you probably just want to rotate away from those fields to begin with. The last thing I wanted to mention about using foliar fungicides is to rotate your FRAC or modes of action classes. Now these numbers will be found at the top of the label, and each number designates a certain class or mode of action. And you just want to rotate those from week to week or from spray to spray. That helps eliminate or reduce the chance of there being disease resistance to that particular material. So that was a quick 1, 2, 3 of pumpkin production. I hope that helps you out. If you need more information, please feel free to look at our OSU IPM YouTube site, which has some videos on pumpkins, or Celeste Welty's u.osu.edu/pest management page, which also has a lot of information about pests and pumpkin production. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And we'll now turn the program over to Carol Schumann, where she talks about geraniums and how we can keep them longer than 1 year.
I'd like to talk to you about a process that I've been using in my garden for a few years now, and it has to do with geraniums. My grandmother always bought annuals, and my mom always bought annuals, and so I bought annuals as well. And at the end of every season, I just hated to throw them all into the compost pile. And so I ran across this idea to save geraniums from one season to the next, and it's called the bare root process. And so what I do each year, once I know that a frost is coming, watch for your frost date, I cut my geraniums back, dig them up, shake off all the dirt, and lay them out to dry for a few days. You want to make sure that they're completely dry to avoid mildew, mold. And so once they are dry, I wrap them in newspaper or place them in a paper bag, and I place them down in my basement. And then 2 to 3 times during the winter, I will bring them out of storage, place some water in a bucket, place the bare root in the bucket, and soak them for 2 to 3 hours. And again, I'll do this 2 to 3 times a year. Once they're soaked, you do want to make sure that they are completely dry again. Don't place them into storage wet. And around March, this would be about the 3rd time that I've done the soaking, I notice that growth has started. And I get very excited because I know spring is coming. This is a bare root geranium that I've had for about 4 years now, and you can see how large the stalk is on it. And it just gets prettier and prettier from one year to the next. So this fall, I will listen for my frost date, and I'll cut it back, dig it up, shake off all the dirt, make sure it's dry, and I'll place it into storage in newspaper or a paper bag. 2 to 3 times during the winter, I'll bring those out, soak them for 2 to 3 hours, dry them, put them back into storage. Geraniums sometimes during the summer can become leggy once warm weather sets in. And so I will cut my geraniums back at that time as well to encourage them to be bushier and in the fall to bloom a little more. And so I hope that you enjoy this process and you have geraniums for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We certainly look forward to saving our geraniums for future seasons. That's all for today. We hope that you all have an absolutely fabulous Father's Day this weekend, and we'll see you next week. Have a wonderful weekend.